right, everybody. Are you ready to get your mind actually blown apart? We're about to speak to Wade Davis, author of many incredible books, The Serpent and the Rainbow, Magdalena, One River, all these different incredible journeys of exploration. Wade is probably one of the few people on this planet that has tried every single psychedelic plant known to modern science. He is a pioneer in the field of ethnobotany, explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society, a Harvard trained scientist, a professor at UBC, and a person who journeys into the frontiers of our existence on a regular basis. My friend, my mentor, a hero of mine, Wade Davis.
One small step for
At
man.
that moment of near disaster,
and with difficulty kept my
Understanding
course.
of chimpanzees in the wild.
It was for us the pleasure of discovering.
Oh, Wade, it's so good to see you. It's been a long time.
Yeah, I know. How are you, my friend? Great to see you.
I've been good. It's been a journey. It's been a journey since I first met you, like what, 15 years ago or 14 years ago or something?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm going to see Terry and Chris Rainier and Telluride a couple weeks from now. And it's very sweet how I think we all, the geographic, it was such an intense place, but it was such great camaraderie. And,
yeah.
I always thought it was like a kind of a great university with no political correctness and a profit motive. And I never felt anything but just being dazzled by the people around me there. The really sweet thing is, all of us, we had our plans, our ambitions. Everybody was kind of going for it. So we were fortunate.
It feels like there was a deep romance that I had with the idea of exploration when I met you. And like you said, we were all just going for it. And now looking back 15, maybe 14, 15 years later, I'm nothing but grateful, right? And I had just entered this society, and you were this epic legend. I've been reading your books now. Maybe I'd compare you to in my mind, the Alexander von Humboldt
Yes.
of our moment. And I asked you what what the most incredible experience you had was, and you handed me that cactus. And I've been wondering ever since why you gave me this cactus. Because there's been a journey with this cactus that now grows in complete proliferation in my backyard. But what made you give me this cactus of all things?
There's obviously been this enormous sort of revival of interest in entheogens or psychedelic plants, hallucinogens. And I think it's been a little bit like all these things, hyped a little bit too much. I think that the hallucinogens are very interesting, obviously. I personally found them transformative. I don't think I'd write the way I write. I don't think I'd think the way I think. I certainly would treat the natural world or understand the natural world without those experiences. And certainly back in the day, when our parents in the 60s would say, don't take these things, you'll never come back the same. They didn't understand that was the whole point, was to seek some kind of different perspective in the world. And I think that certainly ecstasy can be very useful for couples therapy, post-traumatic stress, perhaps psilocybin for end-of-life care, not eliminating fear of death, but helping people come perhaps to terms with it. But of all the plants, the one that gets the least attention and the one that has perhaps the deepest history, going back certainly to Chavin, at least 5,000 years in the Andes, and that appears in the iconography of and textile traditions of virtually every major civilization, coastal and Andean, is Huachuma or San Pedro, or now it used to be called Trichoceres pachinoa. Now it's called a kind of cactus. I think it is a new genus. But what's interesting about it is that to me, it's much more useful than ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is many things, but pleasant is not one of them. And although it's interesting that a younger generation seems to have a different kind of, I don't know, almost gestalt around ayahuasca and seem to find use in it. People of my age always universally echoed the thoughts of indigenous people. And I remember once a Kofan elder saying to me that taking ayahuasca is like nursing at the breast of jaguar woman when she suddenly tears you from the tit and flings you into a pit of poisonous vipers. I mean, that's sort of, to me, that sort of distills the ayahuasca experience. Whereas San Pedro, it's, you know, the main active ingredient is mescaline, and it's very physical. It's very visceral, and it gives you a very deep appreciation of the natural world. And I think of all the things that we need to heal, that's a relationship that's most essential. So I actually think it's a really interesting plant. And I actually have a graduate student, Albert, a wonderful woman, Laura Sugden, who has been working on San Pedro very deeply for 5 years, and her husband is a traditional curandero in Peru. So I'm very much anticipating her PhD thesis, which is going to be a beautiful lyrical document, which I think will be immediately publishable as a wonderful work of nonfiction.
I read your work now, and I didn't. I don't think I appreciated just how much of a poet you really are. Right, the way that you write, the way that you think, the way that you see the world. And when I met you in that crazy, crazy gathering of explorers all those years ago, and you handed me that cactus, I was just at the beginning of a journey where I was looking for archaeological stories,
Hmm.
stories in our ancient past that you can sort of see in the remains of
Well, I think
rocks.
you're being too modest, my friend. I think you were at the absolute forefront of using remote sensing, which has led to the whole transformation of lidar and what we've learned throughout Mesoamerica, throughout the Amazon. I recall you being one of the first kind of characters to come in, recognizing the potential of that. And Albert, I've always thought that you had played a super historic role in the development of that methodology.
Well, I appreciate coming from you. That's a huge, that's a huge pat on the back. I mean, you are a luminary in the field of ethnobotany, uh, and when I didn't realize how much the relationship between that and what I was doing actually was going to matter later on in life. Because when you handed me that cactus, I hadn't even really started a lot of field work. I'd gone to Mongolia a couple of times. I'd traveled around. I'd drink the Eirik, the fermented mare's milk of of northern Mongolia, and felt the reverberation of ancient traditions in the way that I saw the landscape. But then the the journey of my career has taken me to all these different archaeological sites beyond that, right? And in Peru, in particular, I've been, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 times now, at sites which are pre-Inca, are Chachapoya, are, Chan Chan, and over again, you can look at these rocks, and you can look at these structures and these buildings, you can even look at the stories of the rituals, but then to actually feel what those rituals were describing is a whole different thing. And it wasn't until there was this moment that I actually had, one of my porters, we were going high up into the mountains, and one of my porters had been with me while we found this skeleton buried in a chupa, and he started doing all these rituals, and I realized that he was more than a porter. He was a shaman to the other porters, right? And his name was Elder Nunez, and he took me on our day off to this place where I was thinking about you. I was actually in the mountains thinking about you, and he took me to this place, and he had me uh, drink some of this distilled, basically boiled down, just the edges of this cactus in front of this big monument that had been built in the front of a cave. And he told me that we were going to enter through this portal, right? And I didn't really understand how important my understanding of archaeology and of even just understanding a landscape would be until you understood the relationship that human imagination has had through plants into that moment. And that's something you've been doing
Well,
your entire career.
well, I think you raised something really interesting. I mean, one of the things I loved about the cadre at the Geographic is that we all had one foot in the realm of science, but we had a creative impulse, all of us, that allowed us to reach and consider hypotheses that were at the outer edge of the academic imagination, shall we say? Johann Reinhardt, a classic example. He works in Nepal. He's an Everest climber. He comes to the Andes. He puts two and two together. They have human sacrifice. They worship mountains as deities. Why don't we go up on top and see if we can find some burials? And of course, he, being an Everest veteran, had the capacity to get to the summit of those literally scores of 5,000 and 6,000 meter peaks that he climbed to reveal these extraordinary burials. And I think you had something of that same intuition where you saw the potential of this technology. And I think some of these plants can be very interesting in that way. Schultes, the great ethnobotanist who was my mentor at
Yeah,
Harvard,
your
the man who
mentor.
he sparked the psychedelic era. I mean, he used to joke that Tim Plowman, his protege, and I ate our way through South America, and we did a lot of self-experimentation in the early 70s. And you can't, you suddenly have some insights. I mean, I remember once Tim and we found a new species of what was then Trichocereus that we suspected as being psychoactive. We tested it on ourselves on the eastern slopes of Bolivia, and then we took a sort of what Terence McKenna would have described as a heroic dose on the beaches south of Lima, and we had a complete illusion, at least, or sensation of flight. And it struck me at the time, and I don't think it's an unreasonable thought, that as we try to, for example, understand the Nazca lines, these fantastic abstract patterns so carefully laid upon the landscape, but on a scale that cannot be seen except from high above in an airplane, what was going on there? It doesn't strike me as being impossible, because as we had that experience, we actually had this illusion of flight. We were soaring over the desert. We saw these patterns on the ground, and it didn't seem to me impossible that a shaman many years ago, or a spiritual leader of whatever sort, could have had that same experience having ingested San Pedro. And you go back to the prototypic civilization of the Andes, Chavin, and you go to the key site of Chavin de Montar in Ancash, and famously you see the jaguar figure grasping in his hand what is undoubtedly a piece of the columnar cactus. And we know that Chavin, was as much a spread of an empire 2,000 years before the Christian era. A lot of archaeologists have postulated that it was almost more of a fluorescence of a religious idea rather than a military conquest. And so it doesn't seem to me unreasonable that
Wow.
San Pedro played some role in that. And the only way you could begin to even consider that would be if you had experienced subjectively the plant itself, which has
So
these
you saw
effects.
you ingested this it was a cactus. And you actually saw yourself flying above the landscape.
Well, we were. I describe it in my book, One River. Tim Plowman was Schulte's protege. He was 30, I was 20. I was very fortunate to become his field assistant, and that's really what got me my professional start in life and my personal kind of start as well. And we were studying coca. Tim had a big grant to study coca in the 1970s, and at the time, even though the cocaine trade was beginning, no one knew how sordid it would become. But even though that plant had yielded our most important topical anesthetic, and even though efforts to eradicate the fields had been going on for 60 years, and those efforts had nothing to do with the cocaine hydrochloride, everything to do with the cultural identity of those who revered the plant, it was essentially an act of cultural genocide. But there was no science. I mean, there hadn't been any serious work done since Mortimer in 1901. So, the taxonomy, point of origin, the phylogeny, the role in religion and culture, the role in nutrition had never really been examined. And we did that. And I was lucky enough to spend 2 years in the field with Tim. And during that time, of course, he did do the first nutritional study, and to the horror of our backers at the US government, it was revealed that yes, coca had a small amount of a precursor to cocaine hydrochloride, a mild stimulant, caffeine in a coffee bean being an analogy perhaps, but it was chock full of vitamins. It had
Yeah.
proteins. It had more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, perfect for a traditional diet that lacked a dairy product. It even had enzymes that enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate, perfect for the potato diet. And so, it was at the end of that period, and Tim was a botanist. We didn't just study coca. We collected thousands of specimens, and we were interested in everything, which is why Schultes joked that we ate our way through South America. But we did want to see what this plant's potential really was. And because we were just sort of experimenting, I inadvertently gave us a really enormous dose of this, and we were up for 48 hours. But in the course of that experience, um, and I described this in the book One River, we both simply took off in flight. We had this collective vision, and we were and sailing over the desert coast. I mean, obviously, call it a hallucination, call it an illusion. It doesn't matter. It was a subjective experience prompted by that plant, the same kind of experience that could have been had by any human being at any time in human history. And as we soared subjectively over the desert and saw these patterns of creatures on the sand, what appeared to be thousands of feet below us, well, it didn't strike me as being unreasonable to suggest that something of a similar experience just might have prompted the 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 religious authorities of Nazca to do that extraordinary thing that they did. Now, again, there's no proof for that, but one of the things that science is all about, it's not about absolute proofs, but better ways of thinking about phenomena.
Yeah. Yeah. So, just to be clear, this wasn't coca, this was a cactus, right?
No,
That
this
you
was
were
the end of our cocoa. I mean, the reason we did it is we'd become not just best friends, really brothers, and we were splitting up at that point. Tim was going um, um, to I guess he was going back. I don't know, back to Bolivia. Anyway, I was going back into the Amazon and going down the river to the Northwest Amazon, and it was the end of our time together. So it was kind of a big event for us, and we
oh, wow.
decided to
So
mark
big.
it by ingesting that plant together. Um, and I later wrote up, did some research in Huancabamba on the plant. But the point is that you know these plants are fundamental in understanding the Americas. Now, they're not. It's not a universal thing. I mean, one of the really interesting anomalies is that of the 120 hallucinogenic plants, most are from the Americas, not because the forests of equatorial West Africa or Southeast Asia are depauperate, or that the people haven't explored them for biodynamic compounds. In fact, in West Africa, the manipulation of poisons is probably the most ubiquitous trait of material culture. But in those areas, the religious impulse is something else. In West Africa, spirit possession. When I worked in Haiti, I always remember the
Oh,
voodoo
yeah.
priest would say, you know, um, you white people go to church and speak about God. We hear that Indians eat their magic plants and speak to God, but we dance in the temple and become God.
I have this picture of you, in Haiti. Do you recognize this picture? Who are these
Oh
friends
yeah,
of yours?
that was Marcel Pierre in the middle. He was an ex-Tonton Macoute. The BBC had described him as the incarnation of evil. He was nothing of the sort. He was a kind of a low-level bokor or negative priest. He had a brothel of Dominican women in San Marc, but he was my first contact, and he was the first person who prepared this so-called Pudzombi for me, and we became actually very, very, very good friends. Um, but I think that photograph kind of captures the kind of intimacy that I was able to, through love and empathy, not bravado. I mean, the Haitians used to always say to me, "Qui qualité blanc soyez? What kind of white person are you anyway?" And one of
But
my
you're
main
also ridiculously brave, okay? So, I mean, yes, love and connection, but the way that you make these barriers come down
Yeah,
culturally
but
is
I don't think it's
by
brave. I mean, if I, it's
you
interesting.
grant that. Yep.
Albert, that project that became the book, The Serpent and the Rainbow book was written because of circumstances. A very famous psychopharmacologist, Nathan Klein, who had won 2 Lasker Awards, that's the American equivalent of Nobel Prize, came to the Botanical Museum, and my professor Schultes, and he and a professor at McGill, together with the head of the Psychiatric Institute in Port-au-Prince, claimed to have found the real first medically verifiable case of a zombie, which the so-called living dead, and there had to be a material explanation,
Yeah.
and that drew their attention to this folk poison. And I was sent down there to try to find the formula of it, which I did. But uh, the project was funded by a Broadway producer, David Merrick, unbeknownst to me. And for the early months, I had limitless funds. But then suddenly, Dr. Klein died during routine heart surgery, and Mr. Merrick had a debilitating stroke within 12 hours. Strange. And I went from being flush with money as a grad student to having none. And and so I applied to the NSF, but I also walked off the street to a literary agent and got the book advance for The Serpent and the Rainbow. But the curious thing is, when my NSF grant was approved eventually, the reviewers had actually annotated it with a line that said that if I proceeded to do what I planned to do, I'd be killed. That was the
Y
reputation of the secret societies.
well, that's what I'm trying to get at is that, there's a passage in your book that describes a moment where you had to show that you weren't afraid of the fake poisons, but you didn't know that they were fake necessarily, and these poisons, they bring somebody to the point of death. I mean, we're talking about the pufferfish or,
Right.
as you find later, or, the datura plant to pull you back,
Well, I
but
just
all
did,
these
I
things you
didn't.
didn't know about as you're going through this. You're
Yeah, but I
going
didn't
into the
think.
unknown, what you called the
No, but I
frontiers
just
of
didn't
death.
think that I didn't think there was any incentive for anyone to hurt me. And you know, probably the most dramatic moment came when Marcel was a very dear friend of mine, and his wife had been dying of uterine cancer, and I'd been buying blood at this corrupt Duvalier Red Cross clinic. And he came to me in I had a stone hut on the beach, and it was very poignant. He was crying on my shoulder, and I took him back to the crossroads, a place called Maury. No, I forget the name. Maury, maybe I can't remember. And for once, I looked like an American tourist. I had shorts, a t-shirt, and had my little Jeep. And I had not brought my wallet. And as I put him on a tap, I I got a flat tire, and I said to the guys on the side of the road who fix tires manually, I said, can you fix my tire? And then I said, Pag and Cob, I've got no money. And they said, that phrase, what kind of white character are you? And then they started hassling me, and I grabbed one of them. I probably shouldn't have, and I gave him the secret society handshake, and then he sort of flushed back, and it was quite lots of fun. And he sort of said, "We nous gros bagage ce soir. We got a big thing happening tonight." So that night, I had broken down right by Bizangot Sampuel temple. And that night, I went back to the temple at their invitation, but for the first time without a major voodoo priest to introduce me or to vouch for me. And the Bizango Champuel had never really been investigated. They were seen to be criminals. They're much feared and so on. But I thought they were the key to both the zombie phenomena and the power structure of rural Haiti, which I was able to show to be the case. But that the ceremony begins as a standard voodoo ceremony with the invocation of Legba and the drums and so on. But at midnight, you suddenly hear the conch trumpet blow, which is a sign of the revolution, and the fête cache, or the whip crack, the sign of slavery. And you hear the call, Soldats de nuit changez peau, soldiers of night change skins. And everybody, hundreds of people, went into this huge space and came back in these red and black robes. And as they did, I was dragged by 6 men and flung into a room. And I kind of, like in a movie, I stumbled over in the powder of the floor, the dust. And I suddenly looked up, and there was an entire tribunal of emperors and presidents of the Bizango Champuel looking at me. And they quickly wanted to know what I knew, which was too little and too much of the iconography, the passwords, the handshakes, etc. and I just had to do something to kind of break the ice. And always there's a human skull at the base of the Potomiton, which is the axis mundi, the way the spirits come back to inhabit the souls of the living, displace the souls of the living. And there's a human skull with a candle, and there's always a bottle of raw sugarcane liquor, not drunk, but used as a libation. And I just impulsively, I took the alcohol. I mean, it wasn't diesel, it wasn't kerosene that would have burned you, but it's more like lighter fluid. I poured it all over me, and then very deliberately and slowly put my hands in the candle above the skull, lit myself up, and as I was still a kind of human torch, I went back over and offered the secret society handshake to each of the presidents and emperors. And of course, they loved the theatricality of it, and everybody broke the ice. And after that, I couldn't go by that crossroads without being hailed down, But
Wait a minute. You lit yourself on fire into a
yeah,
massive
yeah, I was just like a
flaming
huge torch.
human?
I mean, I burned my hair and my eyebrows, but it's like when you're a kid and you light your finger with lighter fluid, it just evaporates, right? So it
Wait, you're
wasn't really
nuts.
dangerous. It was a perfect piece of theater in that moment. And again, you know this from your own travels, and it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that. I mean, the whole interface between you as an outsider and the people with whom you finding yourself living as a guest, breaking that down is a dance of ethnography, and it's rarely gestures of bravado like that one. It's mostly empathy and love. It's eating what's put in front of you, sleeping where you're asked to sleep, self-deprecating humor, humility, a willingness to help out, all that basic human stuff that would make me welcome in your family's home at Thanksgiving. It's nothing more complicated than that, but it is amazing how fearful people tend to be from all cultures at that cultural interface. And I think if I have one thing kind of going for me, Albert, it's that I've been at that interface all of my life. My parents sent me to Colombia when I was 14.
Right.
In fact, it even began earlier than that because I grew up in Montreal as a Canadian at a time when the French didn't speak to the English and vice versa. And I was in a suburban Anglophone town, plunked like a carbuncle in the back of a traditional French village that went back to the 17th century. And there was literally a boulevard that divided the two worlds. And my mother, when I was 5, would send me to the corner store on the edge of that boulevard, run by a friendly old Francophone couple. And I would sit on their stoop at the age of 5, looking across that road and thinking, wow, right across this road is another language, another religion, another way of life. Why am I not allowed to cross this road? And I've been crossing that road ever since.
Yeah, metaphorically and also physically, right? I know what you mean. I have the ability, I'd say the privilege of having a very easy dismantler of walls, right? I just pull out my leg, and the next thing you know, it's sort of the not self-deprecating, but like showing some kind of vulnerability. And I hand people this
Hmm,
leg,
hmm,
and
hmm.
it breaks down the barriers. I was reading your
Or
book.
even Albert, when you said earlier in our talk, about taking the mare's milk in Mongolia. Well, there are a lot of people who would not reflexively do that as you do,
Yeah.
but of course, food is power. As you know, most traditional communities, the sanitation is impeccable, but there are many frontier places where the sanitation is such that an offered plate of food will be almost certain to give you some kind of giardia or amoebic dysentery or whatever. But I will always eat that food because you can always treat the gastrointestinal problem, but you can never rekindle the trust broken by
Yeah.
essentially saying to people, I'm too good for your food." And I remember
It's
a funny story about that mare's milk because we were making a film for Nat Geo on the Nadam, the horse races, the initiation horse races in Mongolia, and we were on top of a sacred mountain with an Owu sacred shrine, and they offered me the milk, and I happily took a drink. And the director kept saying to me, "Well, can you do that again? Can you do that?" So I ended up, and as I was drinking, shot after shot of this fermented mare's milk, I suddenly noticed all the Mongolian companions were getting more and more freaked out and more shocked. And turns out this stuff is so strong that even people coming back to the country to visit their families from the capital will be hesitant to drink it. And of course, I ended up getting just profoundly ill that we lost a day of shooting. But again, I
I'm
would
drinking
put
a
up with
lot of
that.
Idic. I love this stuff. It's kinda
Well,
bubbly. It's got that, like, I don't know, it makes your tongue tingle and,
no, I think the main thing, I mean, the point is that I would put up 1,000 times with that illness, readily treated,
yeah,
um, as opposed to saying to people on top of a sacred site, "No, I can't take this ritual
right.
offering." You know, unimaginable to me.
That's what I mean, honestly, I totally understand what you're saying, and it might sound woo-woo, but it feels like when you eat something with an open heart and an open mind, I haven't I find that I don't get sick statistically as often, right? Like, I remember going through the streets of India in Varanasi, and I had made these friends that were, this group of, thieves, and one of them uh, had actually grown up in front of the the burning ghat, where the bodies burn all day long on the Ganges. And I went into their home and I was given all this food because we had been on in all these deep ceremonies that he had taken me to. It was right after I'd lost my leg and I was on this kind of journey to figure out where all this came from, the death and rebirth cycle. And my hands were bleeding from the drums and I was, Varanasi is a not sanitary place. But I just had this very open heart and nothing. I don't know how to explain it, but it almost feels like you get what you put out, right? Like, if you show up with suspicion, then you get the suspicion that you've created, right? Whereas if you show up with an open mind, then that actually reverberates with the people in front of you. And I think
I
that
really
when I
believe
read all
that's
your
true,
work.
Albert. I don't know to what extent that will always work physiologically. I mean, we're all capable of succumbing to giardia, but in general, and certainly on a metaphorical and personal, human basis, I think that's a key to everything. And it's certainly a key to your success, and it's the way that I've always lived my life, and so many people I respect at the Geographic have lived their lives. I mean, it's really the key to being able to um, see a way into the soul of another culture. And as storytellers, that's what we try to do, whether our stories are told through history or through across landscape.
What I love about your outlook, which it's become an inspiration of mine throughout my life, has been when you describe other cultures as not being failed attempts at us, but at
Mm.
being these unique other worlds, which are almost like one version of the chapters of humanity. I always talk about how when we find some new archaeological site, it's not something lost in time. It's rather that we've just found another page of who we are,
Hmm.
regardless of where we came from. And, that's why
Well,
I can
yeah,
go
I
to a
mean, I
place
think.
like Peru or somewhere else that might not look like my genetic heritage, but I feel deeply connected to that part of my shared humanity.
Well, I mean, I think this is the fantastic thing of science. The two great scientific moments or illuminations, if you will, in our lifetimes have been the moment when we went around the dark side of the moon, we saw the blue planet floating in space. But the other is the revelations of population genetics and people like our good friend Spencer Wells at the Geographic. It took me, it's interesting. I don't know why I was so stupid because Spencer was a great friend of mine. And I really admired him. And it took me, it was only when people started to attack that program and I decided to defend it that I really dug into what he was doing and realizing how totally revolutionary it was. It's unbelievable. I mean, what population genetics have done is affirm the fundamental truth of Boaz's conviction in regards to cultural relativism. I mean, in our lifetime, genetics has shown that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Biologically, race is a total fiction. We're all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all children of Africa. But the amazing thing is the implication of that. And if we all are cut from the same genetic cloth, all human societies, cultures, by definition, share the basic raw human potential, the same genius, the same mental acuity, and critically how that is expressed and is simply a matter of choice and adaptive intuitions. That old Victorian idea, inspired by Darwin, that if species evolved, so too did cultures. Therefore, there was some kind of hierarchy that went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized to the Strand of London, um, has been totally debunked by modern science, shown to be an artifact of the 19th century, no more relevant to our lives than the notion of clergymen in that time that the earth was just 6,000 years old. What we've seen is that every culture is simply a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human alive? And when they answer that question, they do so in 7,000 languages, which become our human repertoire. And that means something very simple. Every culture has something to say. Each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. And that was the core of my conservation mission at the Geographic. I was recruited there by Terry Garcia because I was one of the first public voices speaking loudly about the fate of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that erosion, of course, was language loss. The fact that of the 7,000 languages spoken the day that I was born, by the time I got to the Geographic, half weren't being taught to children. And so that was, the great revelation is that every culture really does have something to say. I mean, race comes down to nothing more, black and white, this incredible curse of 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 humanity comes down at the end of the day to nothing more than sunscreen and vitamin D. People in tropical climes needing to protect themselves from the sun so they develop melanin, and people in northern climes needing to have greater access to sunlight for vitamin D, developing pale skin. It's nothing more than that. And yet it has
Well,
tormented humanity for so long.
and this is where this has been the most, like you said, one of the most profound illuminations of our time. And it shouldn't be. It's more, like you've said in your TED talk, which I think has had I don't know how many millions of views. We all left Africa. What was it? What did you say? 60,000 years ago, roughly.
Probably 65,000 years ago.
Less than 1,000 people, maybe a tribe of less than 1,000 people, and then we spread out across the planet. Now, when I look around today and I look at, for example, your work, right? You sat in a cafe at Harvard Square and you put your finger on a map, and there you go. You're going to the Amazon, and then just as easily, your friend goes up to the Nordic lands of. Well, actually, I think you went to the Inuit tribes or the
Yeah.
Eskimo tribes of northern Alaska, maybe, and then but now when I feel like my career has had this one incredible privilege of being able to see this cross section across the planet. From the deserts of Jordan to the mountains of Peru to the ancient cities of India to and beyond. And what I've noticed is that you do have this massive diversity of culture. Now, when you do have that massive diversity of culture, and it speaks to what you said, which is that, these are all different versions of our imagination, choices, cultural choices. That is very clear. And like you said, environmentally, some places you get more sun or you get less sun. Now, as an ethnobotanist, you also maybe I wanted to know there's a ecology that in our cultural evolution, before everybody was traveling around by boat and then plane and everything else like that, there was an ecology where cactus only grew in some places, and then maybe psychedelic mushrooms grew in another place, and something else grew in another place, and they were isolated to those locations. Now, we talk about this, and you started out the conversation by saying you had this one moment where you flew in this altered state of consciousness over the land, and you could see how that would then create a visual imagination that could then cultivate a cultural, progression. Uh, my question to you, which has been something that's been haunting me for a while, because every archaeologist that I've worked with says that at the bottom layer of their excavations, they find entheogens. They find these pathways to altered states of consciousness. whether it's a plant or, maybe not even just a plant, the rituals, right? Like you look at the whirling dervishes and they spin until they get
Mhm.
into an altered state of consciousness. You talk about trances in your book. You talk about all these different things that get you to these altered states. But there are different visualizations. So now when I look at, let's say, South American culture and art and expression, that and the way the cities are laid out and the buildings and everything like that, is that influenced by the ecology of what people had when they started developing imagination and culture in those regions? Is there a relationship to Nordic culture that has to do with something that they
Yeah,
ate
yeah. I
there?
mean, I think when we think of what I mean, the word culture is tricky to define. It's kind of a constellation of expressions that come together, and one of those is the landscape in which people determined to live out their destiny. It's like the writer Lawrence Durrell said, this is landscape. This defines character. Culture springs from a spirit of place. I mean, he famously said that you could depopulate France and resettle it with Mongolians, and within a generation, the same national traits would emerge: the sort of affection for fine food and beautiful men and women, the disdain for Americans. This would just come out of the soil of France, right? And there's some truth to that. I mean, I think a bigger distinction to draw is when we think, for example, of climate change or the biodiversity crisis. We see these as threats to humanity, and they are. But it's important to remember they weren't caused by humanity. They came out of a particular worldview, and just as any other culture is a product of its history and its choices, we too are. And one of the things that happened in Western Europe, in many ways to the benefit of all, is we desperately tried to liberate the individual from the tyranny of the collective and liberate the mind from the tyranny of absolute faith. And so, with a single line, when Descartes deanimated the world, science made a house cleaning of belief. The triumph of secular materialism sort of became the very definition, indeed the conceit, of modernity. The idea that the flight of a bird could have meaning was ridiculed. And the world became seen, in effect, as a kind of stage set upon which only the human drama unfolded. And I think that can account for how we, in our tradition, treat the natural world. When I was a kid, well, not a kid, but a young man, I used to work in some of the toughest logging camps on the coast of British Columbia. And one of the things that struck me is that you could only do what we were doing to the forest, completely destroying it, if you had no sense of it being animate in any way, right? And it's important to recall that way of thinking about the world, dominant, ubiquitous, powerful it may be, and it gave us great things: the scientific method, allopathic medicine, you name it. But it's highly anomalous in the human record. And most
Mm,
societies, the ethnographic record makes clear, base their relationship with the natural world on reciprocity, some basic iteration of the idea that the earth owes its bounty to people, people in turn owe their fidelity to the earth. And that is reaffirmed through ritual all over the world. And so, again, one of the things that we threw out with Descartes was not just magic and mysticism, but also metaphor. And so, if I'm raised to believe that the forests of British Columbia exist to be cut, that will make me a different person than a young man amongst the Haida, the Kwakwaka'wakw, who believe that the forest is the abode of spirits. It must be embraced during the initiation rites. Or I
mm,
was raised to believe a mountain's a pile of rock ready to be mined. That makes me different from the young men you've encountered in the mountains of southern Peru, raised to believe that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct their destiny. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's how the belief system uh, um, impacts the way of thinking about the land and therefore the ecological footprint of the culture. And
mm,
so when you go to the Barasana in the Northwest Amazon and they tell you that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality, or if you go to the Kogi and they say that the blood that flows through your veins is no different than the water that flows down a river, these aren't just poetic ideas. These are ideas that motivate and behavior with real consequences. I mean, the classic clash of culture in Australia is indicative of this. When the British first arrived in Australia, um, they saw a people that looked strange, that has simple material technology. But what really offended the British is none of the Aboriginal cultures had any interest in progress. They didn't idealize the idea of change through time. They had no interest in improving upon their material lot. And because optimism and progress through time was a very kind of ethos of European society during the time of colonial settlement of Australia, the British, in their inimitable way, concluded the Aboriginal people weren't human, and they began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, in the lifetime of my grandfather, it was debated in Melbourne in Parliament as to whether or not Aboriginal people were human or not. In the 1950s, ranchers had quotas as to how many abos could be shot with impunity who trespassed upon their ranches. A school book used across the curriculum of elementary schools in Australia in the 1960s, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, included the Aboriginal people as interesting wildlife specimens of the continent.
God.
And what was in fact missing was the inability of the British to understand the subtle devotional philosophy that was a dreaming. And the dreaming is not a dream. It's the idea that the earth both exists and is perpetually being born. There is no sense of time in Australia. Not one of the 670 dialects and languages of the 10,000 clan territories has a word for past, present, or future, or for time. The entire purpose of life in Australia was the antithesis of progress. It was stasis. The whole goal of life wasn't to change anything. It was to do the ritual gestures deemed to be necessary to keep the world just as it was at the time of its creation, when the ancestors sang the world into being as they walked the song lines that connected and entered the dream time. So the interesting thing, again, Albert, is not to say who's right and who's wrong. If all of humanity had followed that trajectory, yes, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon. On the other hand, we wouldn't be talking about climate change and our ability to transform the life supports of the planet. And the fascinating thing is that, just think about this. If we accept what we said earlier, that all human populations share the same genius, imagine what it would be like if all of Western science had focused on pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had their conversation, or if all of human Western intellectual capacity had been focused on understanding the biology, the soil, the ecology of Central Park in New York. Boy, we'd know a lot. And in the clan territories, that's exactly what the Aboriginal people have been doing for 65,000 years, understanding where they live, keeping it as it has always been.
Yeah, powerful, and I just reflect on you. You told me to read this book before, to check out the book that you just your most recent book,
Oh,
Magdalena,
yeah.
and you know, in reflection of that story that you just told, of two worldviews coming into clash with each other. I've been thinking a lot about the Kogi, that you write about, because
Mm,
I had a chance to meet the Kogi, and I told you at the beginning that, I took my leg off, and then I could open up the experience of
mhm,
the conversation with this Kogi Mamo, the
mhm,
the the priest, and, where is it? I had this journal, that I was carrying with me at the time, and I just remember writing, 'cause you write so beautifully about the Kogi, but I thought maybe I could just get your reflections on this. This was from an expedition, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. I can't believe I'm talking to you about this. I mean, you literally wrote about these Kogis, and then I was writing, this Kogi philosophy, of, in this book, and then I found the notes in my journal, and through the day, we film, running from one epic location to the next. Yesterday, a Kogi priest gave us access to his world. His home consisted of 2 small huts. One hut was for men, while the other was for several wives that he had. It took a long time for him to open up to me, and maybe it was only when I removed my leg from my body that I was able to get his unguarded response. Understandably so, though, as the Kogi are the descendants of the Tairona who once inhabited this place until it, like most of the Americas, was destroyed by disease brought in by the greed of Spanish conquistadors looking for lost gold, El Dorado. He said once this place was fuerte, or strong. Now that the outsiders had taken all the gold and the beads, it was very weak. He believed the sun, the earth, the water were all deities, and when you remove these things from the place, you take their power, you take its power. When I Asked if he had one thing to say to the world, the response was, "The snow is disappearing."
Mm.
As we finished our conversation, he took my leg and began to perform an incantation to the sun deity, who he said was the creator of everything and oversaw my leg. And then we left. And then I read in your book, there was a page here where you said, and you're talking about what's happening now, and the integration of, in the chapter of that you titled "The River of Cumbia," uh, and the work that Colombia has been doing to try to actually lift the voices of indigenous communities. And you say, to the contrary, the indigenous people of Colombia, and you list the Barasana and the Mokuna and the Kogi and the Wiwa, among many others, uh, are very much alive and fighting not only for their cultural survival, but to also take part in the national and global dialogue that will define the future of Colombia and quite possibly the fate of life on Earth. Now, when I read that and I think about where we are, the Aboriginal belief that time is not actually happening, we're trying to keep this thing in stasis. And then the reflection that, hey, the rivers are constantly moving, the glaciers are melting, and the world is in this complete opposite to what the Aboriginals would like it to be, which is in stasis. Uh, Yet there are these bits of knowledge that you've bumped into in indigenous communities, which you said in that could save life on Earth. Uh, like what do you think the future is? Like how do we get to that point where
Well, I'm very optimistic. One of the things we have this idea that these cultures, quaint and colorful though they may be, are destined to fade away as if by natural laws. If they're failed attempts at being us or failed attempts at being modern, nothing could be further from the truth. In every instance, these are dynamic, living peoples, not fading away, but by being driven out of existence by identifiable forces, industrial, ideological, whatever. And that's actually an optimistic observation because if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. And that's indeed what has happened in Colombia. When I first went to the Northwest Amazon in 1974, it was a very sad place. The missionaries, the shadow of the rubber era, and it felt like a place where something had happened a long time ago that was good, but like all anthropology at the time, we predicted the demise of culture, the end of diversity, or whatever. Well, then something quite magical happened. In 1985, President Virgilio Barco said to a friend of mine, Martin von Hildebrand, a young anthropologist, to do something, quote unquote, for the Indians. And in 4 years, as the head of Asuntos Indígenas, Martin did more than something. He secured legal land tenure for 57 ethnicities in the Northwest Amazon, an area of land the size of the United Kingdom, and that was encoded in perpetuity in the 1991 Constitution. And during the late 80s and 90s, as Colombia struggled with the conflict brought on by our consumption of cocaine, a kind of veil of isolation fell over the lowlands. And behind that veil, a whole new dream of culture was reborn. And when Martine and I made a film for the Geographic in the early, 2004, something like that, Stephen Hugh Jones, head of anthropology at Cambridge, who had lived with the Barasana, and he had sadly predicted in the late 60s their imminent demise in a BBC strand of films called Disappearing Worlds. Stephen flew in to join us halfway through, and he walked into a longhouse, a maloca, and he suddenly saw hundreds of men and women in full ritual regalia in this extraordinary ceremony. And he walked out, got on the satellite phone to his wife in London, and said, "Christine, you won't believe my eyes. The only thing that has disappeared are the bloody missionaries." And you mentioned the Kogi and the Arahuacos, we of the Cancuano of the Sierra Nevada. I mean, when I, again, in 1974, when I first lived with the Arahuacos, parents of my friends at the National University in Bogota would say, ¿por qué quiere vivir con gente sucia? Why do you want to live with the dirty people? Well, now the last 5 Colombian presidents, as a first act of office, they've traveled to the Sierra to pay homage to the Mamos who have emerged as a symbol of continuity and hope. over the 50 years of conflict. And that represents
Mm.
an extraordinary change in perception. And the reason that's so important is the message of the elder brothers is not trivial. After 500 years after the conquest, they are still here to speak to us, and they speak in full paragraphs with great articulation. They're still ruled by a ritual priesthood, and the training for the priesthood is remarkable. The young acolytes are spend 18 years in the ceremonial temple, in the environs of that temple, as they learn the Baroque religious ideology of the belief system. And it maintains that their prayers and rituals literally maintain the cosmic, therefore the ecological balance of the world. They think that their prayers and rituals are responsible for maintaining the well-being of everything. And after this 18 years of initiation, in which the young acolyte barely sees a horizon, he's suddenly taken on a journey to the heart of the world, where he goes from the temple to the ice, and from the ice to the sea, and from the sea back to the temple. And the entire time, the priest who has trained them, the Mama, was saying, "You see, it's as beautiful as I've told you all these years, and it's yours to protect." I mean, and to think that these
Wow.
voices and these people are there to, looking down at the very beaches where Columbus's men arrived on the third voyage, 2 hours by plane from Miami Beach, and here they are to continue to spread their message. And so these are
And
the sorts
also
of things that I find to be very hopeful.
they exist on the highest coastal mountain range in the world, right? And so then all the different
Well, it's
ecologies
it's
that they're
it's it's
traveling
more than
through.
that. It's so fascinating. It's a triangular massif with each side 90 kilometers roughly, that soars right over the Caribbean coastal plain almost to 20,000 feet. It's the highest coastal mountain range on Earth, and within that homeland is found every single ecological niche to
Yeah.
express on the planet. So it really is, in a sense, the heart of the world. And I've been um, working with the Atawakos in particular now for coming on 50 years. And I just spent a month on pilgrimage in January and February of this year. And I'll be going back in November. And,
To the Sierra
I
Nevada.
learn more and more every time I go. And it's now been 50 years.
I had a chance to go to Ciudad Perdida, and spend time with a friend, Santiago, who's the director of archaeology there, and, um, and he showed me this what they call the map stone, and it was this connected view, that was created by the Tirona before the world was destroyed, by the explorers looking for gold in El Dorado. But it showed this hugely interconnected world across that Sierra Nevada plain, and
Hmm, hmm.
it
I'm
was,
sure there's tremendous archaeology still to be done, particularly on the northern slope, which is so heavily forested.
but it's so steep, right? I mean, we had to put our
Mm,
lidars not just pointed down, but to the sides because the helicopter couldn't get to the angle to be able to map the side of these
mm.
trees,
Well,
and
one of the amazing things, like Ciudad Perdida, which is, a site I think is impressive as Machu Picchu, but it was only
absolutely.
first discovered by looters in the 1970s. And I don't think Soto, a wonderful Colombian anthropologist and archaeologist, I think did the first excavations in the mid 70s. That's how recently that site was uncovered.
Honestly, it's just the tip of the iceberg because even what we saw in the LiDAR was that there was more all throughout that mountain range, but we just couldn't get there because we tried, but there's the coral snake, there's, everything trying to there's a zillion scorpions everywhere you look. Like, but then you also have what you described as well, which was in your book, the remnants of guerrilla warfare and all these other things that make it hard to get through that landscape. Yeah, I just wanted to get a little bit more into because what got me, first into your work was The Serpent and the Rainbow. I mean, this is one of your I would say probably one of the more famous chapters of your work and, going into I mean, Wes Craven made a movie about about it. There's, there's this legendary sort of idea that you could get to the frontiers of death and then pull somebody back. But not to talk about that project specifically, but rather, you were originally funded by by Klein, right? And it was a quest for looking for anesthesias or analgesics,
Mhm.
and we just launched at UCSD a Center for Psychedelic Research that was started around the uh, the phantom pain experience that I had with my leg, and we just had our
Mm,
first clinical trials with psilocybin and phantom limb pain, where we used an fMRI map, and we could see that the brain was actually functioning to significantly, clinically, statistically. Actually, I shouldn't even talk about the results yet because they haven't been published yet. But it
mm,
it affirmed what I experienced on my own, which is that through this
mm.
altered state of consciousness, my neuroplasticity could let go of the pain. Now, that's purely pharmacological, and it didn't include what you wrote about in your book, which is the importance of set and setting. And when I look back at the history of mushrooms, you know, on one hand, you can get to the 1970s and talk about, the sort of Western first experience. And then on another hand, you can look at the story of somebody like Maria Sabina, right? Who here's a quote that she had, which is, I hope I'm quoting her correctly, but translated was, there is a world beyond ours, a world that is far away, nearby and invisible. There is where God lives, where the dead live, where the spirits and the saints, a world where everything has already happened and everything is known, a world that talks. It is a language of its own. I report what it says. The sacred mushroom takes me to the world where everything is known. It is they, the sacred mushrooms, that speak in a way that I can understand. I asked them and they answered me. And when I return from the trip I have taken with them, I tell what they have told me and what they have shown. And she talks
Mm.
about these journeys where she's tapping into a spirit realm that is giving wisdom. And you, of all people in the world, have traveled through this world that is at the boundary of our scientific understanding of why something might work. You can put two, like you said, two columns on a board, and and sort of figure out the pharmacological aspects of things. But there's this other mysterious question, which is, where are we going culturally in our altered states? This is not a new phenomenon. When you look at a person like Maria Sabina, who people say is really the mother behind, you know, the Western world's understanding of psychedelic mushrooms. Uh, it's clear that in some cases, we've in many cases we've lost our connection to this indigenous knowledge of where or description of where we go to in these altered states. Yet humanity has always tried to go there. So what is
Yeah, I
that
mean, you
frontier?
mentioned it. Well, you mentioned it earlier and it's an important point. Is that the quest to invoke some technique of ecstasy periodically to enter a different realm of consciousness is so ubiquitous in the human record that it's got to be seen as a basic human appetite. And Andy Weil is probably the guy who wrote best about this. But and Andy made the point that not just about set and setting, but also that there are any number of vehicles to the to get you there, if you will: meditation, ordeal, a dance, prayer, um, and of course, one of the most powerful and immediate is the use of these remarkable plants. And one thing that's curious is that there are not that many of them. I mean, Schultes, who was the one who really was the world's authority, and he was very liberal in his assigning psychedelic status to a plant. But even with his liberal inclusion of a number of plants that might just have been toxic or poisonous, perhaps used in interesting cultural ways, but not truly entheogenic. But there are about 120. And Andy Weil and I were the first to publish on the only known animal source of hallucinogen, which turns out to be the toad of the Sonoran Desert. So there are not that many of these plants,
Wait, the
but
toad
they
uses
are
the
so
plant?
powerful. What's that?
The toad uses the plant to
No, no, no. The toad, the toad, it's the large Caribbean toad, Bufo marinus,
Oh, right, yeah.
12 inches across, was rumored to be psychoactive by Mayan archaeologists in the 60s who saw psychedelics everywhere. And I had written a series of papers showing that it couldn't possibly have been psychoactive because in its parotid glands has these very powerful cardiac steroids that would have killed you before you enjoyed the putative effects of bufotenine, which is also found in the glands. But it turns out that the different species of that toad have different constituents that are so consistent that they're used for taxonomic delineation. And by chance, the toad of the Sonoran Desert, Alvarius, has 15% of its gland pure 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, the most powerful hallucinogen known from nature. And so Andy and I did self-experimentations and wrote this up in the early 90s. And that was the first scientific account of a truly hallucinogenic agent from the animal kingdom. But my point is that these powerful plants and that toad create effects that are so otherworldly that they're difficult to describe. And so, for example, Gordon Wasson, who was sent to Huautla to work with Maria Sabina by Schultes in the early 1950s. Schultes met him in 1953 when he came back from the Amazon. He famously wrote that trying to explain to someone who had not gone through the experience what it felt like and what the sensations were of this mushroom experience was like trying to tell a blind man what it was like to see. And I think that's a standard subjective response. It's very, very difficult to explain to anyone who's not experienced a psychedelic what the experience really is, because words simply fail. And it's one of the hardest things to try to describe in writing, and it almost always falls flat. I think the most important thing you're alluding to, Albert, is that when you are in that subjective state of a good experience, that world, that multidimensional world, feels very much like it's a real world, and that the world that we inhabit in our mundane lives is just some kind of crude facsimile. And I think that's what has drawn people into these spaces. And that's why I say, I mean, those who experimented in the early years with these plants and LSD and other psychedelics often fell into two kind of camps. You had the Tim Leary, John Lennon camp that just kept trying to use more and more and more LSD. Lennon famously claimed to have taken LSD 1,000 times, which is hard to imagine. Trying to get more and more, learn more and more. And I'm not sure that it's not a journey of diminishing returns. The other camp, like Ramdas, Richard Albert, who Leary's partner in investigation, and of course George Harrison, also of the Beatles, were very much for the school, get the message and hang up. In other words, I was more in that school. I mean, I've experimented with virtually every hallucinogen you can name, but I never was that interested in continuing to use them. I found them very helpful at a certain point in my life when I was trying to deconstruct a world that had been imposed upon me by my upbringing. But when it came time to assemble the world that I wanted to create, I had no interest in blowing that world apart, right? And yet I used the lessons learned in those early days, lessons that have made me the person I am. As I said earlier, I wouldn't write the way I write. I wouldn't interact with the natural world. I wouldn't understand cultural relativism. I wouldn't have even been able to, I think, so quickly grasp the metabolic cycles of life itself, photosynthesis, respiration, the Krebs cycle. I remember, I never studied biology until I came back from the Amazon in what would be my third year of the university. I had never taken a biology course in my life. And yet when it came time to understand photosynthesis, I just memorized the metabolic pathways effortlessly, because to me, they were all like creation myths, stories. But I go even further. I wouldn't think the way I think. I wouldn't understand homosexuality. I wouldn't treat women the way I treat women. I mean, my entire life would have been different if I hadn't had the psychedelic experience. And I go back to that kind of quip about our parents saying, don't take these things, you'll never come back the same. That was the point. And don't forget for a moment that that's inherently subversive journey. I mean, one of the reasons that we were drawn to these substances is that we all suffered in the 60s from Baudelaire's malady, horror of home. We grew up naive and perhaps insensitive to what our parents had gone through in their lives with the horror of the wars. But we were in this kind of a bourgeois world of mediocrity that we wanted to escape. And that's what I forged my life around. I knew that if I didn't
Mm.
jump off cliffs, I'd never get out. And I was desperate to get out, if you will. And my whole life was motivated by a single word, yes. I just made a point of saying yes to any new experience. And that's really became the kind of motif that allowed me to become um, go from being that kind of desperate vagabond boy to being a contented and realized scholar at the age of 70. But it was that impulse to get away from a world that we've found to be problematic. And, sometimes anthropology is accused of loving every culture but your own, and there's some truth to that. I mean, I think I was looking to escape a kind of monochromatic world of monotony with the hope that I might find in a polychromatic world of diversity some clue to the wonder of what the human being is really capable of being and knowing. It was very much a quest. And of course like any quest, like any pilgrimage, the goal is not a place or a destination, but a state of mind. And it's funny, now at 70, when I look, sometimes, I do a lot of public speaking as you do, and you get so that you can be at the podium speaking and almost dissociate yourself from the person delivering a talk. And I'll sometimes float above the podium and kind of look down at this character and think, how did that little boy from the suburbs of Montreal grow up to have these thoughts? And certainly, the one ingredient in the recipe of transformation is the fact that, like many of my peers, I lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having taken some psychedelic drug.
And even the way that you speak, I mean, the way that you speak about it is so profound. Um, but I have this question that keeps on coming up in my mind, which is that yes, psychedelics they've opened up a part of your mind, and for many of us, a part of our mind that allows us to imagine the world in a different way, right? And when I look at my leg journey and the phantom limb pain, it was literally like bending the spoon. I had to change some reality and then was able to break apart that reality and then meld back into a new one. Now, when I think about the evolution of culture, it's like new ideas had to come from somewhere. And the birth of
Mhm.
new ideas and new knowledge, to me, comes from a source that's as weird and mysterious as the birth of new gene mutations. Like, what is this realm where new things come from? Where this chance thing happens, where all of a sudden new knowledge can be born. And you talked about, the frontiers of death. You say that there's this one passage here. For all peoples, death is the first teacher, the first pain, the edge beyond which life as we know it ends and wonder begins. And for me, there's also this question where, the realm beyond birth and death is also this thing that's always confronted us. It's like, what is in this other realm? These other realms where somehow our reality kisses this other realm, and yet we don't know what's on the other side. And I wonder sometimes, like, is our relationship to these altered states in a way the same existential questioning that has plagued humanity since the first imaginations, of what is it that what is it that we come from? What is this other realm?
Well, I think since whatever it was that at one point we were of an animal nature, at one point we weren't, whether we like that or not. And if you go, I spent a lot of time in the upper Paleolithic caves of France, and it's interesting if you look at the art of Chauvet 32,000 years ago, and then Lascaux 17,000 years ago. The aesthetic is remarkably consistent, right? The same pigments, the same use of space, the same use of light, the same figures, right? And that's kind of curious. An aesthetic that lasts 5 times the chronological distance that separates us from the building of the Great Pyramid at Giza. And I think that in a way, humans at one point were of an animal nature, and then whether it was the birth of language, development of the size of the brain, or some other evolutionary catalyst, we developed consciousness. And I kind of think that art form is like postcards of nostalgia, like an attempt to go back to our animal nature across a chasm that cannot be bridged. And if they are postcards of nostalgia, ours was a very long farewell. But it left us with two fundamental questions: how and why. And those are answering those questions are the slivers of insight that have created culture. And of course, the fascinating thing is that why is a religious question and how is a scientific question. And religion really is very different than a notion of the sacred. I mean, religion is all about answering the question of what happens to us after death, and no one knows. Every major religious tradition ultimately comes down to a desire to wrestle with eternity and come out on top. But the sacred is something very different. The sacred is what is around us at all time, the kind of luminosity around us that we can feel if never achieve. Um, it's like D.H. Lawrence said, long before the Buddha and Jesus spoke, the nightingale sang, and long after the Buddha and the words of Jesus are gone, the nightingale will still sing. And the purpose is to be like a bird flying through space, at one with the sacred. And the sacred is something that we all aspire to experience, not in death but in life. The sacred is all about living and the
Mm.
forces that are around us. And I think one of the things that these plants and these other rituals that that bring the sacred into being, but particularly these plants, is they give us a direct visceral experience of the sacred. I mean, and again, taking these plants is not about the twiddling of thumbs. They're not for everybody. That's what the concept of set and setting is. The mental set you bring to the experience and the physical setting in which you have the experience. And there are some mental states that are not conducive to being blown apart by the illumination of these substances. And that's where people have to be cautious in advocating, for example, that these substances are for everybody, because they're not.
Mm.
And they're not for everybody at certain times of their lives, and they may be at other times of their lives. But certainly for those who and the vast majority of people who experience these things have a overwhelmingly positive um, experience, and that's what Maria Sabina is talking about: is the opportunity actually to enter that realm of the sacred in the
Mm.
here and now, and to feel it and to know it, and to return from it, having been transformed. And you can't
That
take
one did
these
it.
things and come back the same. That's the whole point.
When you gave me that cactus 15 years ago, I had no idea that I would find myself in a cave one day with a Peruvian shaman, Elder Nunez, who had boiled this thing down into a little juice, and it was in between filming, right? So I'd gone into this world with this very structured story that we were trying to find this lost, sort of hidden city high up in the mountains that would have been the precursor of the Inca. But then Elder took me to this cave where there was all these stairs that had been built up inside, sort of leading up to the side of this cave. And here's a picture of what when you're standing in the cave, you look out and there's this
Mm,
big monument that had actually been blown up by uh, I don't know who later, many years later, but the Inca had originally built this
mm,
sort of monument looking out at the cave. There's Elder playing his flute,
mm,
and then uh, in the back of the cave was this double jam doorway carved into nothing,
mm,
carved into the
mm,
face of the earth. Uh,
mm,
and and he told me that this was a doorway to the other world, to the other realms. And then he played this music, which amazingly sounded very, very well. It sounded exactly like something that I had heard before in Western music. It was a Simon and Garfunkel song was playing. This. It was the tune of what was it's a Peruvian song known as
Oh,
El
El
Condor
Condor
Pasa.
Pasa.
Yeah, here it is. Here, I'll play it for you. This is the recording from that moment on my phone. Here it comes. Wow, and then we were in this it took us into the state of trance, and later he told me that this song was a song that was passed down from 6 civilizations before the Inca, to him, uh, to this moment, and that the song was this thing that existed in the earliest stages of humanity and sort of was this tune that carried forward. Certainly, the drum is something that I felt across the world, that beat, right? The first time we met, I was just on my way to Mongolia, and I ended up finding myself on the side of a mountain with shamans entering into a trance with the drum,
Mhm.
on the side of a sacred mountain, not knowing that this was gonna take me to this altered state. Now, I listen to that song and I hear the same drum. I've traveled all around the world, I've heard the same drum. You write about the drum, you write about the drum that came from Africa in the slave ships that made their way to, the forests of Colombia, right? And you talk about this rhythm, and our connection to this beat, this heartbeat. And then I had that feeling. I got into that place in front of this double jam doorway, listening to that ancient song, which we don't actually know the true origins of. It came from a folk, a folk culture that ended up becoming the Condor Pasa. But I left that moment having ingested the cactus that you'd given me 10 years prior, in the hands of a shaman. And all of a sudden, I understood truly the words Pachamama, because Pachamama is described as, the way you talk about the earth, the name of the earth. And it was no longer this abstract thing. It was alive. I was feeling the living being of the earth. I could feel it. I felt like I was on something alive, and I was so humbled in it. And when I came back to
Mhm.
the crew the next day, I was like, "Guys, the whole shoot's gotta completely change. The whole story about the Inca is not a story of just, some kind of, power message on the side of a mountain." It's a relationship to Pachamama. It's this understanding that comes with, humbling in in the face of our relationship with nature that I could only access through this
Mhm.
combination of music and entheogen. And I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for, if that
Well,
moment I
I
finally.
think that's very nice of you. I do think that's why I think San Pedro, although some of the wild populations are under serious threat now because of its popularity with young travelers, but it is the one substance that I think more than any other kind of opens that portal to understanding and appreciating and sensing the beauty of the natural world in that sense. And that's the relationship more than any other that I think we have to work on as human beings. um, so I mean I hold that plant in high regard.
Do you think, of when you think about all of all of those journeys that you took, were they was there a unified message that you received in those altered states from all the different hallucinogens that nature has presented?
Well, I mean, I think with ayahuasca, you can, I've tried to take ayahuasca, and I only take it really in ritual context with mostly in the Northwest Amazon, Barasana Macuna. Um, I don't find it very useful because it's so overwhelming that you almost just are clinging. I mean, that's the idea of it. It's seen as a kind of a almost like an ordeal that you must get through to achieve illumination. I suppose I've never worked hard enough or never taken it often enough to actually get through that. So I find it not very helpful. Whereas with San Pedro, I've always found an immediate, visceral, even sensual connection to the wonder of the natural world, and that is, I think, what you felt, and I think that's a lesson that can be very helpful to people. I'm not sure that the kind of I can't judge it, but for me, the kind of psychic incest that I find is provoked by ayahuasca, I don't personally find that very helpful. Um, but
Not necessarily ayahuasca, but you said there's how many entheogenic plants are there on planet Earth?
well, there are, if you
No.
look at Schulte's record, I think there's probably 110, 120. But the actual active ingredients tend to fall into kind of two categories: tryptamines, the indoles, and um, um, when it really comes down to it, you're talking about are you getting high on a tryptamine that would be like psilocybin or 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine, the varrolas, the mushrooms, the toad venom, or are you taking something like an Indo, like LSD or um, ecstasy or mescaline? Um, so there's not, I mean, and there are other substances, of course. I mean, the tree daturas with scopolamine and atropine,
Oh,
very, very dangerous. Iboga is a whole different alkaloid. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
that's
what's mind-blowing is that this grows in everybody's backyard in San Diego, and people
well,
don't realize.
it's a beautiful ornamental plant, but the vernacular names for it in the Andes, borrachero, the drunken one, the jaguar's intoxicant, the tree of the evil eagle, give you some sense of the subjective effects. It's a very dangerous um, drug to take. It brings on a state of psychotic delirium, visions of hellfire, a burning thirst, a sensation of flight, total amnesia. A lot of people die trying to slake their thirst in small puddles of water. Even, I mean, it's not one that Schultes ever took, and generally, it's seen as something that the shaman will take when everything else fails, and the idea being that just to touch that realm of madness is to achieve illumination. It's a tree datura. Um, um, and it's only found, curiously, in association with human habitation. It's not found in the wild.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
Weird, right? It touches this other dark realm, right? It's these.
it's well, it's a datura. It's in the Solanaceae, the potato family, which is a family of choice for black magicians throughout the world. The hexing herbs of Europe, belladonna, henbane, the daturas of ancient India.
Did you see this article that a couple years ago found, the Pinwheel Cave in this is in California between Bakersfield and, the coast. And they found this image, 500 that had a datura bud that was embedded in a little
Uh,
hole right next to the image, that they dated to 500 years ago in a cave in
well,
California. It
no,
was just
it's clearly been around for a long time. Uh, but it's I've never met anyone who's taken it who would ever take it again.
my friend was gardening, and she said she was gardening, and halfway through, she had to sit down and realize that she had somehow touched a plant that was making her really,
Well, it's
really.
topically active. I mean, that's why scopolamine, which is what we put on for seasickness, is topically active. That's why we put little you know um,
Oh,
stickers that deliver. And atropine is a very useful dilator of the pupils for ophthalmology. So all these drugs, the difference between poison medicine and a hallucinogen is often just dosage.
yeah. Well, you're a person who's experimented at the realm of the edge of those, and I gotta say, I know that I know that your daughter's about to deliver a baby, and you've got a lot of things to do, which, by the way, congratulations, my friend. I'm super excited about,
Thanks.
that for me one day. I wanna be a grandpa one day, but
I'm sure you will be.
but I just wanted to say that, many years ago, I bumped into you, and you were, I mean, you're a luminary. That's the way I think of it, but also a friend, and you put your arm around me and you said, "Welcome to the club." And now I can look back 15 years later, and I really do see that the things that we explore are at the realm of the explainable and the unexplainable, you know? And some part of it you can answer with science, and the other part of it is more philosophical. And when I read your books, I feel like I'm looking at the words of, like I said earlier, Alexander von Humboldt, or Walt Whitman, or somebody else. You dance into this realm of imagination and poetry that I think is pretty much the painting of your
But
mind.
it's funny. The funny thing, Albert, is a lot of people think of that of the writing. But if you take a book of mine like Into the Silence, it took 12 years to write. And that book won the prize for the top book in the English language for nonfiction the year it came out. But to write that one book on Everest and the Great War, I bought 600 books. I visited 57 archives. I spent months in monasteries in Nepal to know what it was like at Rongbuk in 1921 and 24. I went with Dorje Latu and climbed peaks all around the environs of Everest, and so the interesting thing is, you do the research, which is so important. And a lot, it's like Truman Capote said of Kerouac, there's writing and there's typing. And similarly, there's research and there's Xeroxing. My books tend to be insanely researched. And then you step back and you distill the material as would a storyteller around a campfire. So there's a sort of you don't quite know sometimes how much information you're getting. I mean, I have a new book that's just come out called Beneath the Surface of Things, which has an essay on climate, which completely kind of deconstructs the way we've been going about addressing the climate crisis. And I mean, that essay took months and months to get right because it's such a tricky thing to take on the climate consensus. But again, it's a lot of hard work as well as attempting to spin words in a way that will touch people both intellectually and emotionally.
Yeah, the poetry of it is based is really just the tip of the iceberg, as you're saying, even on the cover of your book. Just beneath the surface. And like this, we only have this time, and it's a short amount of time to try to go through something as meaningful as your life journey. So I hope that we can do this again, my friend. I know that
I'd love
you're
to, Albert, anytime. Anytime. I mean, it's really great to be with you and to remember, the Geographic was this just fantastic place. It really had a family thing because, I mean, everybody was doing such amazing things that you could how could you be anything but supportive? And I remember even when Jim Cameron became a explorer in residence. I mean, here's a man who had made the most successful films in the history of Hollywood, and he came to the Geographic like he was the new kid on the block, so deeply humble, and so grateful to be there. And I think I was very touched by his attitude, and we became good friends. But I certainly, when I was there, tried to reciprocate in every way possible the grace that the place had given me. And I remember you coming there, and I'm just so grateful that looking back, I was able to welcome you. As you recall, it means a lot to me, Albert.
yeah, I don't know. I'm lost for words, Wade. Um, I'm lost for words and gratitude. So I'll have to come up to once things have settled down with your grandfatherhood. You're coming up. I'll have to come to BC. You're at
You're
UBC.
always welcome.
My grandfather was a professor at UBC many years ago.
Oh, wow.
In yeah, in uh, Oriental Studies at the time, and I'm gonna come up there, and we're gonna explore the realms of imagination together.
Anytime.
But
I'd love to have you with us. You've always got a bed in my house.
thank you, Wade. It's an honor,
Okay, Albert. Thanks a lot.
but thank you, Wade. I gotta say, I'm just grateful.